Okay. Um, so first, take a few minutes to think about these questions. Probably some of these questions are reasons why you decided to come to this webinar. Um, and once you have some answers to like any of these questions, it doesn't have to be all of them. You can type them in the chat. It seems like you're both more comfortable typing in chat. More sleep. Yeah. Yeah. So is it kind of a pattern of putting off work until later in the day, and then it takes longer than you would think, and you end up staying up really late to get it done? Is that the kind of thing we're talking about? Or is it anxiety about your work keeping you up at night? Okay, so you're saying that it tends to be that you're pushing your work till later in the day. Yeah, and also more productive and efficient. Could you expand on that one a little bit? I mean, it does seem like an obvious connection, obviously, but pushing work till later in the day. Yeah, yeah. So maybe you've spent several hours in the day sort of thinking about your work, threading your work, maybe doing a little bit of your work, but getting distracted or something. So it might take several hours from the time you start thinking about the work. But if you just got down to it, maybe it would have taken, half the time or a quarter of the time. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Yeah. And I used to do that too. Probably I still do, not so much with work tasks, and I don't go to school anymore. But sometimes if I'm dreading something like doing taxes, it can ruin my whole day, even if I don't actually do it. Um, Whereas if you get something done and then you take your leisure time, it's kind of happier leisure time, I would think. Okay, so I am having trouble with the pop-up. Gotta get rid of that. Okay. Um, So I have a couple of slides with, typical reasons why people procrastinate. Um, I'll give you a couple of minutes to read this one. I'll go to the next one. And, please comment on which of these reasons you relate to or which you think are your personal reasons for procrastinating, if there are other ones. I'll go on to the next slide. I'm definitely sorry. I did not introduce myself. My name is Ruth, and I'm a Learning Services Coordinator at the Student Learning Commons. Okay. Oh, so somebody did put reasons in the chat. Mostly perfectionism. If I'm going to do something, I need to have enough energy to do it perfectly. And then the other one is distractions and worried of not doing well. Yeah, so fear of failure. So I really see like a lot of underlying anxiety under both of those responses. And quite often anxiety and negative emotions are really the driver of procrastination. It's really a myth that procrastination results from poor time management. It's really more the result of poor emotional regulation, specifically with factors like anxiety. Um, Perfectionism is a really hard one. Um, I've worked with a lot of students that have had that issue, and it's led to avoiding certain tasks. Sometimes it's a combination of avoiding certain tasks that are difficult, that they don't feel like they can do really perfectly, and also spending too much time polishing up projects that they're enjoying more, they feel more confident with. Some of it is, I think, about help seeking. And I think a lot of people who procrastinate also procrastinate about seeking help, unfortunately. Like it all kind of gets wrapped up in feeling anxious and wanting to avoid facing things and wanting to avoid admitting that you're struggling. But if you can have the courage to seek help early, to take a look at your assignment fairly early on while you still have time to seek help and still have time to do a good job. And if you're feeling like this is not something I can excel at, maybe it's time to go and talk to a teaching assistant so that you can, build your confidence, like ask your questions, talk about your barriers, why you don't think that you'd be able to be successful at it. And through the help seeking, it might look like it's a little bit more doable. And if it doesn't the first time, you can, keep going back if you started early. And that often will help a lot of people. Or use the Student Learning Commons resources, like if a lot of it is about if you're writing something and your critical voice is kind of giving you writer's block, it really helps to separate out the revision process from the process of just getting your ideas down. And one way to do that is to book an appointment well in advance, and they can be booked up to 2 weeks in advance with a peer educator to help you with the revision and editing process at the Student Learning Commons. And maybe you say, well, I don't have any problems with that. I'm a good writer. I don't need help with revision and editing. But even if you don't really need help, having an appointment booked specifically for that purpose might help you mentally separate the revision and editing and polishing kind of process from the process of just getting your ideas down. And it might unstick you a little bit, kind of like, okay, that's taken care of. I'm not going to look at the revision and editing until somebody is in place to help me. This slide is really just a word of caution that, not to be too hard on yourself. Like it is definitely a good idea if you do procrastinate to try to come up with strategies to help you. But at the same time, we are still in the pandemic crisis. Being back at school in person is, pretty new to many of us. And there is still a lot of stress associated with what's going on and feeling unsafe possibly. So very early in the pandemic, I went to a webinar given by Anxiety Canada. And they said, don't even say I'll do my best. Sometimes you're encouraged to say, oh, I'll just do my best, as a way of trying to say that you don't have to be perfect. But at the same time, currently people might not really be in a mental space to do their best. And even that might be too much pressure. So they really encourage people to think in terms of, I'm going to do what I can, given this current situation. And I've been trying to think about that too. Another piece of advice along the same lines that I received at that time is that, just each day, make sure you do one productive thing and one thing that brings you joy. So just kind of keep moving forward. I realize as a student, you probably have multiple competing demands for several productive things. So it's good if you can have a day where you get a lot done on your to-do list. But if there's a day that you're really struggling health-wise, mental health-wise, whatever, even just moving forward a little bit with a little bit of productivity and a little bit of fun, it can be a win. And it can be sometimes all you should expect for yourself, and just be happy with that. The other thing is to keep in mind that instructors are probably facing a lot of these same stresses right now, which does make things more difficult on the students as well, but also to try to have some empathy and understanding. So this diagram is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a very basic concept in psychology that I personally learned it in high school. I don't know, at what level it's taught now, but the idea being that everybody has, certain needs. And if your lower level needs aren't being met, it can be very, very hard to move up to higher level needs. And learning at the university level, it's basically a higher order need. It has to do with esteem, wanting to achieve, wanting to self-actualize and become the best version of yourself that you can be. And that is very difficult when our safety is compromised. I guess we are getting back in social contact with people, but maybe not as much as pre-pandemic. So our love and belonging needs might be somewhat compromised still as well. So all the more reason. I think you should always go easy on yourself, but all the more reason now. Are either of you taking any courses where there's no live sessions, either in person or on Zoom? Courses with just a Canvas component, for example? Oh yeah, so somebody does have a distance ed course, so this is relevant. Yeah, the challenge is that there's even more procrastination challenges for those courses, which is why I'm asking. Because if there is a class and you're either going or you're going on Zoom for your class, it can kind of keep you on track. Like there's a certain structure. It's reminding you about assignments or tests that you have coming up. But a course that's just distance ed, that's just on Canvas, where you're watching recorded lectures, it can almost disappear. You go through your day-to-day going to your live lectures, maybe going to your job, like things where you have to be someplace and do something. And the Canvas shell for the course can just sit there in the background and you don't address it. And you just have the sense that, I can do it whenever. But quite too often, I can do it anytime tends to morph into, I'm never doing this, because it's just not in your face. So the way to resolve that situation is to schedule it as if it was a regular class. So if it's a 3-unit class, then it's expected that you will spend 3 hours, the equivalent of class time, plus the amount of time that would normally be allotted to schoolwork outside of class. So at least for the 3 units of class time, you can say, I'm going to pretend that this class is on Tuesdays from 2 to 5. And every Tuesday from 2 to 5, I'm at least going to get started on my week's work for this course. And that can really do wonders. That can mean that you don't have 5 weeks of lectures to watch before your midterm is coming up, for example. Procrastination really is a cycle. I got this diagram from Health and Counseling Services, and they really work on the psychological aspects. And this really, highlights the role that stress and anxiety and emotions play in procrastination. So I would imagine that as I go through this, you probably will relate. You can sort of start the cycle at any time, but I will start at the top with, when you become aware, oh, I should study for my exam, or I should do whatever. So you wake up, say on a Sunday morning, and you were planning to do the studying on Sunday morning. And then you get to the stage where you're appraising the task, resources, and outcome. And I think that's kind of the stage that you two were talking about with the perfectionism and the fear of failure, where your appraisal is, this is too difficult for me to do well on, or, what if I fail the test, or something like that. So the cycle tends to be triggered when there's sort of a negative appraisal of how much it's going to take or how well you might do. And when you have that thought that, oh dear, I'm not going to live up to my expectations on this task, that's when the anxiety is triggered. Quite often, you get stressed out, you feel tired, you feel like you want to take a nap or something. And the distress leads to making excuses mentally, like, oh, I'm just too exhausted now. I'm going to go back to sleep, see how I feel in an hour or two when I wake up. Or, I really feel, I don't feel like this. I'm not in the zone. I can't focus. I'm just going to, watch a couple of YouTube videos first and then try focusing. I think we all make these kinds of excuses to ourselves, and you get kind of sucked in by them. You believe the excuses. I don't know why you believe the excuses, because, you've said it to yourself many times and it hasn't really worked. But I think people do tend to just continue believing that after I do something else, I'll be in a better position to do the work I need to do. So you engage in the avoidance behavior, like, a nap or watching YouTube or going out with your friends or, doing housework or whatever it is. You're temporarily feeling better while you're doing it, maybe a little bit after, because you've distracted yourself and you're not feeling the anxiety about the task anymore. But after some period of time, the task awareness sets in again, and you have less time left than you had to begin with. So the appraisal could even be worse. Like it could be like, oh, I was worried about this yesterday, but now I only have 2 days to do it. So there's no way that I'm going to do well on it. So, the cycle can actually kind of escalate and be harder and harder to get out of. So definitely I've met a lot of students where it really spirals and they don't end up handing things in or something. I think that's kind of when ends happen. But the good news about this cycle is that really you can intervene at pretty much any point. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So when you're appraising the task, for example, the resources or outcome, and you think, what if I fail the exam? There are ways of challenging those negative thoughts. You could say, have I thought, have I previously ever thought that I would fail an exam? And how did I do when I thought that? I mean, I guess it could be that sometimes you have failed exams, but a lot of the time people think that, and then they write the exam and they do a lot better than expected. Could also be, you're confronting yourself with, well, I'm up to date on my reading. I understand what's going on in lecture. Why wouldn't I do well on the exam? Or like at this point, I have a week to study. All I need to do is plan it out and make sure that I do a bit each day. And that should be enough to cover it so that I'll do well. So, really just challenging those panicky thoughts in the first place. If you don't intervene then and you start feeling stressed and anxious, tired, that kind of thing, there are things you can do to intervene at that point as well. Like, possibly you might have a mindfulness practice. Mindfulness meditation is a really good way to overcome the anxiety and refocus and be able to get back to work. And once you are practiced in that technique, it might only really take a few minutes, a few minutes of like closing your eyes, breathing, meditating, and then you might be able to refocus yourself and get to work. But for it to be that quick, you really need to practice mindfulness meditation. Do either of you do any of that? I don't see any responses, so I'm thinking maybe not. You can start with, like, there's certain apps like Insight Timer might be a good one, where you can have somebody kind of reading a meditation script to you. Also, Health and Counseling Services has drop-ins. I think it's like every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 12:30. And I believe it's on Zoom right now. At one point, it was in person. But if you go to the Health and Counseling website, you can find out about mindfulness meditation drop-ins to learn how to meditate. And that's a great way of intervening when you're feeling anxiety in the moment. Also exercise, so somebody, a lot of the time running or something will get somebody to get past their anxiety. So, engaging in your favorite form of exercise for, say a half hour. You might wonder, well, how is that different than watching YouTube videos to relax? And, it's like it physiologically can reduce your anxiety. Plus, it's less likely to suck you in for a lot longer than you're planning to devote to it. Like, say, okay, I'm going to run hard for 15 minutes, chances are that in 15 minutes, your body will have calmed down, and you will be able to do something, mental activity at that point. Whereas, if you say, I'm going to watch YouTube for 15 minutes, chances are that it won't just be 15 minutes. And then at the avoidance stage, where you do the behavior that isn't studying, there are ways to intervene. And one way is really just kind of tricking yourself. So say you were planning a couple of hours of a study session and you're like, no, I want to watch Netflix. Instead of holding yourself to that couple of hours, you can do something like say, okay, maybe I will watch Netflix, but I am just going to start for, even 5 minutes. You could say 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever is an amount of time where you're not going to feel completely overwhelmed. And, just kind of get started on it before you'll allow yourself Netflix. And quite often, once you get started, even for a few minutes, you realize it's not so bad and you can go for somewhat longer. Can either of you think of a way of intervening at any point in the cycle? Okay. So we did talk about challenging yourself to devote even 5 minutes to a task, and that really can be a way of getting past the biggest barrier that a lot of people feel, which is getting started. And I think we also sort of talked about the other point with the perfectionism. But it's always a good idea that when you get an assignment, whether you're a perfectionist or you're not a perfectionist, to at least look at it for 10 minutes, 15 minutes on the first day. Even if it's like a term paper and you're getting it in September and it's not due until early December, it's very easy just to put it away and say, okay, I'll look at this in a month and a half or something. But if you kind of go through it, you sort of see what's involved. Maybe you plan out a bit of a schedule. You start thinking about what topic you're gonna try. A couple of things can happen. Well, actually, let's talk about what happens if you don't do that. If you put it away for a month and a half, and you look at it later, it can be like a ticking time bomb. So you're not necessarily thinking about it, but it's there. And the longer something is put away, like the anxiety tends to build up around it. So maybe when you heard about the assignment in class, it sounded okay, but the longer you leave it, it seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger and scarier and scarier and scarier. So spending a bit of time on it on the first day, it kind of stops that from happening because the anxiety hasn't had a chance to build up yet. So if you just do some very basic things with it on the first day, you might realize that, wait a minute, this is not that hard at all, and then maybe you can keep working on it slowly and gradually. Or even if it makes no sense to do so, because, say it's a big paper and part of what it's based on is what you'll be learning in the meantime. At least if you sort of have thought about some possible topics, your unconscious mind will be engaging with the material as it's coming in and the possible topics that you thought of. And when you do get back to it, it might come easier. But also if you look at something early and you start to panic right away, like on the first day after you've received it, because you've read, the first couple of paragraphs and you're like, whoa, that does not sound something I'll be able to do, then it's very early and you can get help as needed. Like I said before, you could see your TA. You could make appointments with the Student Learning Commons. You could see a librarian to help you with the research. You could talk to classmates. There's just so many more help-seeking opportunities if you start early on the help-seeking process. And if you seek enough help, then at some point, it's not going to seem so overwhelming and difficult anymore. Okay, so we talked about just deciding to spend a small amount of time in a couple of contexts on the task. So that's like breaking the time down to do the task. But you can actually break the task down itself. So I just want to get you to do a little activity on your own, and you can report back about it once you've done it. So if you have something to write on, like, a notebook, or you can open up Word or something on your computer. Just think of one task that you have been procrastinating, and that will be the task that you focus on for the rest of this short activity. And once you have a task, then the next step is, I'd say what's remaining of the task, because maybe it's something you've already started, but if you haven't started, you can break down the whole task. Think of some small manageable steps, so what is a step that I can take to start this project or tasks that takes less than a few hours. I think, at the most, it should take a few hours of time. It could even take 5 minutes, but you've been holding off on it. And I will give you an example from somebody whose work I'm going to be mentioning soon as well. Like there's a professor at Carleton University named Tim Pitchell, and he's one of the most prominent procrastination researchers in the world. And I heard him on the radio a while back, and he was saying that if he's procrastinating on something, if there's a type of task that he dreads, then he breaks it down super, super small, like not even 5-minute steps, at least for the first few steps. So he gave you an example of writing a student a letter of reference. He said that he always dreads doing that. So he says, like first he will open his letterhead on his computer. Like that's the first step. Then he will open the email from the student asking for the reference, and he'll reread it. And so really it can be really, really super small steps at first just to get you into it. So it depends on the size of your task and how long you have to do it and how long you think it will take, as to what extent you break it down. Some people would, if it's a relatively discrete project that you're planning to do in the next week or something, you might break down all the steps to it into small steps. But if it's a really big thing, then maybe you really just want to identify the next few steps or even the next one step. So it doesn't really matter how many steps that you identify at first. But the key is that if you haven't planned out all the steps for the project, when you finish a step, you immediately have to plan out the next step. So it's just about always having something to work on, keep moving forward. If it's a really large project, I used to go to workshops that were offered by professors who supervise theses and dissertations, and they would advise graduate students, that if you have it all kind of broken down, identify some steps that are particularly easy and save those steps for days when you're not feeling well, because it's so easy if you have a cold, you're kind of under the weather, just to say, okay, I'm not going to do anything. When in fact, like that could be when you, maybe edit your reference list or something, just something that's not as challenging. So yeah, at least identify the first 2 or 3 steps. And hopefully you've been doing that while I've been talking. And then if you have some sort of scheduling system, the next step would be to enter the steps into your scheduling system, like figure out when you're going to do the first step, day and rough time, and, kind of write it in, plan it out. I was just thinking of something else and I'm trying to think what it is. Yeah, okay, what I was thinking was that what I used to do as a student is that if mentally I was scheduling some sort of task, or if I was scheduling it and writing, say it was a research paper, the productive way of doing it would be to break it down, and what I would write in my schedule would be something like spend a half hour trying to find articles at the library or something like that. But every time I went to work on that research paper, I wouldn't have a discrete task like that planned. It would just be work on my research paper, and that would just seem so huge and overwhelming every time. And it's not nearly so overwhelming if you just write like the small step into your schedule, or even if you don't have a written schedule. I mean, I do recommend having some sort of written schedule, but even if you don't, when you think about the task, think about just the next step as opposed to like the whole research paper. So have you tried this activity now? Okay, Amanda said, I already had a broken down to-do list before, but I didn't write out my estimate of how long each task would take. It does make it easier to schedule when I know how long it'll take. Yes, that is a very good point. A very good point. Yeah, and especially if you think about, like, is this the right amount of time roughly to constitute a step, or should I break it down further? It kind of forces you to think about how long things will take. And I think a lot of people are very challenged to have accurate estimates of how long something will take, and then that becomes a barrier in itself. So we tend to suggest taking your initial estimate of how long something will take and multiplying it by 1.5. So if you think that a step is going to take an hour, give yourself an hour and a half. And also if it's a repeated task. So say you tend to procrastinate on your readings and you've got weekly readings in each course. Then in, this time of the term in September, go course by course. And every time you do your reading, keep track of how long it takes. So for my psych course, the first time I did my readings for the week, it was 2 hours. The second time it was 2.5 hours. The third time it was 2.5 hours, so then you kind of start getting a sense of, okay, I should, allocate 2.5 hours in my schedule every week for my psych readings. So the estimates get more and more accurate the more you do the things throughout the term, or if you have a research paper, and you need to come up with 10 articles or something like that. I mean, maybe that's something that you don't repeat many times in the term, but maybe you've done it a couple of times in your university career before. So you can get more accurate in how long it would take to do the library research. So just making this list now, it really just took a few minutes. So I think sometimes people hesitate to plan things out, to plan out their tasks, because they think that the planning process in itself is going to suck up a huge amount of time. But especially if you take the approach of just planning what your next step will be and scheduling it, it really doesn't take long at all. It can be a very quick process and get you on track for the next step. And just, committing to what you're going to do next. And I think writing it down in your schedule is a good way of committing to it. Sometimes people find that accountability will help them move forward and commit to getting certain things done. So you might find a friend or a family member that you will check in with whenever you are planning, scheduling a goal, and say, okay, tomorrow I am planning to find 5 articles for my paper. Could you please check in on me tomorrow night to make sure that I have done that? And that can be very motivating for some people. Okay, so there's this website called the Assignment Calculator at SFU. And it's the next step for breaking tasks down. It actually does the work for you if it is a research paper or if it's, an essay, some sort of writing assignment. Have any of you encountered this before? Okay, one of you has and the other one has not. Yeah, so basically, if you go to this website, or I always just tell students to Google SFU assignment calculator. It defaults to the day that you do it as the day to start. You can always change it. You put in the day that it's due, or you could even put an artificial deadline, like you want to get it done 3 days in advance or whatever. You put it into this box, and it schedules 10 steps. Like it always breaks a writing assignment down into the same 10 steps, and it assigns artificial deadlines for each step. So the first step is understand your assignment. And if you look at the resources it's giving, like that encompasses choosing your topic, narrowing down your topic, that kind of thing. So it's given a deadline date for that step. And there are URLs as well that you can go to if you don't really understand what's involved in narrowing your topic. The next step is research. And there are URLs there to help you with your research as well. Research, it usually gives several days, assuming you've put in enough time as the time you have to work on the whole thing. And sometimes, like, that's a step that I find kind of tricky, that if it's a paper that requires a lot of research, the research can be really overwhelming in itself. So that's one that I say, take it as a starting point, but maybe you want to break that step down further. Maybe, so it's given you 5 days. So plan out what research you're going to do on the first day, what you're going to do on the second day, etc., to make it less overwhelming. Or there are some courses, or types of papers where it isn't a research paper and you're expected just to, maybe go from what you've learned in the course and your own critical thinking. You can just cross off that step entirely, and maybe adjust the dates after that. So, I mean, this is a tool that is customizable. So every single step will also have an artificial deadline, and it will also have links that can help you. And it really separates out the revision process from the initial drafting process. So if you tend to be a perfectionist in your writing, and it's hard for you to separate it out, it's a really good tool if you follow it step by step to get you to separate out those two processes so that you're not quite so blocked at the initial draft stage. I see that we are quickly running out of time. So, I mean, I'm just going to keep going, and I am recording this. So if you need to go back, I will post the recording in the next, say, 5 business days or something on the SLC website, and you can watch the rest of it if you have to leave, or you could stick with me if you want. Okay, so another idea is to keep track of the excuses you make, the procrastination excuses. So they become more aware. Like sometimes the excuses are almost unconscious. And, you're saying, oh, I just need to take a nap. And then you just take a nap. Like you don't really think critically about the excuses. But if you keep track of the excuses, then you'll probably become more aware, that if you have something to work on and you find yourself saying, I think I'm going to go bake, that, wait a minute, that's one of my procrastination excuses, so I should actually challenge whether going to go bake makes sense at all. So knowing your thought patterns when you procrastinate, that can help. And also just kind of, this is almost kind of a mindfulness process in itself. So acknowledging what you feel, accepting what you feel, so don't beat yourself up. And just kind of breathing, like I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I'm just going to close my eyes. I'm going to take a few long, slow breaths. And I'm going to see if I feel centered enough to refocus on the task. And if I don't, I'm going to do that again. So sometimes if you like fight against the emotions, and just kind of say, calm down, you'll be fine. You've got to do this. Sometimes trying to fight it is, it just kind of keeps the feeling and the excuses going. Whereas it might be better just to say, yeah, I'm really anxious about this. I really feel like taking a nap. That's okay. And just kind of try to relax or meditate or breathe your way through it. And also, just in terms of, it's kind of like cognitive therapy that you can do for yourself as well. Asking, is there a time when I didn't procrastinate? So like, how did I manage to do these kind of overwhelming tasks and not procrastinate? I think something that people do that doesn't really help the situation is they label themselves as being a procrastinator. I'm a procrastinator, and that makes it sound inevitable that, on any given task, they're going to procrastinate. So really thinking of it as a behavior that happens sometimes, that doesn't necessarily have to happen all the time in your experience, that can actually be a step. So thinking about exceptions, thinking about, like different ways in the past that you didn't procrastinate, how you could transfer it to the current situation. I think when people were just always learning from home during the pandemic, it was such a challenge because going to a productive study environment would be, how people used to address it when you're studying at school, maybe like being in the library where there's like a lot of people around studying, or studying with their, a classmate or study group or something like that. And those resources were not as easy to access during the remote learning phase of the pandemic. So I would say, well, how could you adapt that? Is there, like, if you like studying with other people, are there other people working at home in your household? Could you sit around, the kitchen table with other people in your household and have a study session? Could you, do it over Zoom? Just like various kind of creative suggestions like that. And the same applies when it's not really that situation. Just sort of think about, like a couple of terms ago, I had this paper that I really couldn't get started on. And finally I did, and I got into a good pattern of working, and I ended up, finishing it up, and it was really good. So, what did I do that got me unstuck? And just kind of like looking for clues and keeping track of times when you got yourself out of this procrastination cycle, and sort of building a toolkit that you can resort to. So we talked about environment. I think a lot of people find it a lot less distracting at their home. Some people find they need absolute silence, like the 6th floor of the library is really good for that. Some people want, kind of a buzz of people working and interacting around them. So like the 2nd or 3rd floor of the library, or a like a coffee shop or something might be better. Some people are like productive when they're up at school, and they'll go to the Bennett Library or something, but then they don't get nearly as much done on the weekend because they're at home. So you might just want to like make a point of, okay, when I wake up and, I'm going to get dressed, I'm going to get ready. And, maybe I don't want to commute for an hour and a half to go to SFU because it's the weekend, but maybe I will, drive for 15 minutes and go to my local library. And that can really make a difference, having a productive environment that you can go to when you're not at school. The Pomodoro technique, I think a lot of students find really motivating and sustaining. If you're not familiar with it, you're setting a timer, working for 25 minutes. When it goes off, you take a break, you set a timer for your break, which is 5 minutes. And the whole point of the timer is that you're not distracted by thinking about how much time is left. And people can modify the Pomodoro technique. So some people will say, I can focus for longer than 25 minutes. So I'm going to do 45 minutes and then do 10-minute breaks. It's customizable. Using your distractions as a reward. So, if you want to watch Netflix and, sometimes you spend a whole afternoon watching Netflix when you had planned to do your work, just, withhold the Netflix from yourself until you do a certain amount of work, and then limit the Netflix, so instead of an entire afternoon, say, okay, I'm going to give myself an episode, maybe 2 episodes, go back. learning to say no, so sometimes it's kind of a combination of you procrastinating, but also like people distracting you. Like friends asking you to go out and you're saying yes, or even being called into work and you say yes. You could sort of say, oh, it's my boss's fault, I'm not procrastinating. But sometimes, people are just kind of waiting for that request to happen, like just really wanting to jump all over anything that they're asked to do other than work on a particular task. So some of it is about, your own kind of impulse control, but some of it is also like, you might be afraid of, disappointing somebody. I think, usually it's you're disappointing somebody or that you're afraid of missing out on the fun thing that your friends are doing. So, I say experiment with it. If you're somebody who never says no, experiment with saying no occasionally and paying attention to what happens, to how the person reacts. Usually somebody who cares about you reacts well, a lot better than you expect. And also, what did you get done when you said no to that social occasion? Like, was it a waste because you just ended up watching Netflix anyhow? Or, did you actually value that time more because you sacrificed something for it and you got a lot of work done? So we talked about, also partnering up for accountability or having a study group. There's this study with me video that has a student studying, and it's in a Pomodoro session. So if you want to do the strict Pomodoro, 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, rather than setting a timer, you can just have this video on in the background. And also there's something that's going to be starting up. I think it might have started up. You can check on the Student Learning Commons website. There's like a virtual study hall called Study Hall at Home, where you can join with other students over Zoom at certain times of the week. I think there's 3 different options. Okay, so Amanda left because she has class. Oh, I keep advancing the slides when I don't want to. Yeah, so if you get writer's block, sometimes just setting a timer and like just dumping out everything that like anything that comes to mind about the topic in 10 minutes, without censoring yourself, that can sometimes free you up towards a first draft. That would be like meaning that you've already done the research and you know something about the topic. And sometimes doing your first draft into voice recognition software can really help, because a lot of the time people that have writer's block, they still can talk about their project fine. If a friend says, oh, what topic did you choose? And, what are you going to do with it? And you can talk it out really well, but you feel paralyzed when you're writing it because you're thinking that, the sentences should all sound perfect in the first place. Then it really frees you up to just kind of dictate it. Because when you see the way I'm talking, I've got all these fillers, like, nobody expects what they say to be grammatically perfect. But you can get like your ideas down really well. You just have to spend a lot of time cleaning it up later, but it forces you to separate the creative process from the critical process. So getting back to being kind to yourself, which was one of the first thoughts that I started with, and I'm going to also get back to talking about Tim Pitchell, the prominent procrastination researcher. So he had research finding that the more you beat yourself up for procrastinating, the more you feel guilty, the likelier it is that you're just going to continue procrastinating. So the people who really would tend to just forgive themselves and move on after they procrastinated, maybe get curious about like, well, what happened there, and adopt more of a problem solving approach as opposed to a guilty, I'm going to beat myself up approach. They tended to procrastinate less in the future. So I want to just leave you with this short video about how to be a good friend to yourself. So I will get to it. And I have to get to the right tab. Whoops. Oh my goodness. Okay, I hope you're seeing the YouTube video. Are you seeing the YouTube video? Put the thumbs up. Oh, put in the chat. Yes, good. Okay, I'm going to play it.
Trying to be a better friend to yourself sounds like an odd idea initially, because we naturally imagine a friend as someone else, not as a part of our own mind. But there is value in the concept because of the extent to which we know how to treat our own friends with a sympathy and imagination we seldom apply to ourselves. If a friend is in trouble, our first instinct is rarely to tell them that they are fundamentally a shithead and a failure. If a friend complains that their partner isn't very warm to them, we don't tell them they're getting what they deserve. We try to reassure them that they're essentially likable and that it's worth investigating what might be done. In friendship, we know instinctively how to deploy strategies of wisdom and consolation that we stubbornly refuse to apply to ourselves. There are some key moves a good friend would typically make, which can provide a model for what we should ideally be doing with ourselves in our own heads. Firstly, a good friend likes you pretty much as you already are. Any suggestion they make or ambition they have about how you could change builds on a background of acceptance. When they propose that you might try a different tack, it's not an ultimatum or a threat. They're not saying that you have to change or be abandoned. The friend insists we're good enough already, but they want to join forces with us to solve a challenge they feel we would properly benefit from overcoming. Without being flattering, good friends also constantly keep in mind certain things we're getting right. They don't think anything wrong with the odd compliment and emphasis on our strengths. It's quietly galling how easily we can lose sight of all our own good points when troubles strike. The friend doesn't fall into this trap. They can acknowledge the difficulties while still holding on to a memory of our virtues. The good friend is compassionate. When we fail, as we will, they are understanding and generous around our mishaps. Our folly doesn't exclude them from the circle of their love. The good friend deftly conveys that to err, fail, and screw up is just what we humans do. We all emerge from childhood with various biases in our character, which evolve to help us cope with our necessarily imperfect parents. And these acquired habits of mind will reliably let us down in adult life. But we're not to be blamed because we didn't deliberately set out to be like this. We didn't realistically have a lot of better options. We're indelibly required to make big decisions before we ever really understand what's at stake or how our choices will play out. We're steering blind in all our large moves around love and work. We opt for a move to a different city, but we can't possibly know whether we're going to flourish there. We have to select a career path when we're still young, and we don't know what our later needs will be. In long-term relationships, we have to make a commitment to another person before we understand what it will be like to tie our lives so deeply to theirs. The good friend knows that failures are not, in fact, rare. They bring as a starting point their own and humanity's vivid experience of messing up into play as key points of reference. They're continually telling us that our specific case might be unique, but that the general structure is common. People don't just sometimes fail, everyone fails, only we don't know about it. It's ironic, yet essentially hopeful, that we usually know quite well how to be a better friend to near strangers than we know how to be to ourselves. The hopefulness lies in the fact that we do actually already possess the relevant skills of friendship. It's just we haven't as yet directed them to the person who probably needs them most, namely, of course, ourselves.
Okay, so that's really about it. Do you have any questions, or would you care to share what your next step is? Like what from what you learned here you'll implement? I could stop the recording. Oh. All the suggestions were really helpful. I'm going to work on breaking tasks into small parts, I guess. Great. Yeah, I think that really should help. Okay, so take good care. Have a good evening. And I hope you come back to use the Student Learning Commons services. Bye.